You've probably met someone like this. Maybe it's a coworker who somehow turns every conversation into criticism. Maybe it's a friend who only calls when they need something. Or maybe it's someone closer, a family member who leaves you feeling emotionally drained every single time you interact with them. And here's the confusing part. You start the conversation feeling normal, calm, stable, but by the end of it, you feel irritated, guilty, exhausted, or somehow smaller. You replay the conversation in your head thinking, wait, what just happened? If you've ever had that experience, you've likely encountered what psychologists call a toxic person. But the word toxic gets thrown around so much online that it almost loses its meaning. Anyone who disagrees with us becomes toxic. Anyone who annoys us becomes toxic. But real psychological toxicity is something deeper. It's not just difficult behavior. It's behavior patterns that consistently manipulate, drain, control, or destabilize the people around them. And today, I want to walk you through something important, not just how to recognize toxic people, but how to deal with them without losing your sanity, your confidence, or your emotional energy. Because the truth is, learning to deal with toxic people is less about changing them and more about protecting yourself. Let me explain. Imagine your mind like a phone battery. Every interaction you have during the day drains or charges that battery. A good conversation might recharge you. A laugh with a friend might boost you. But toxic people? They're like apps running in the background, draining your battery without you even noticing. You hang out with them, and afterward, you feel strangely exhausted. That's not your imagination. Psychologists have studied emotional contagion, the idea that we absorb the moods and attitudes of people around us. In fact, research from the field of social psychology shows that humans subconsciously mirror the emotional states of others, which means if someone constantly brings negativity, criticism, drama, or manipulation into your life, your brain begins adapting to that emotional environment. Your nervous system starts living in a low-level stress state. This is why dealing with toxic people is not just an annoyance, it's actually an energy management problem. And the first step to dealing with it is recognizing a hard truth. Toxic people rarely think they're toxic. Most of them believe they're the victim. Think about that for a second. The coworker who constantly gossips believes they're just telling the truth. The manipulative friend thinks they're just asking for help. The overly critical parent thinks they're trying to make you better. From their perspective, their behavior is justified. This is why trying to argue with toxic people rarely works. You're not debating facts, you're clashing with someone's entire worldview. Your brain is trying to solve a problem logically, while their brain is operating emotionally. And this mismatch creates one of the most frustrating experiences in human relationships, feeling like you're talking to a wall. Have you ever noticed that? You calmly explain something, and somehow the conversation ends with you apologizing, even though you weren't the one who caused the issue. That's not random. Many toxic personalities rely on subtle psychological tactics like guilt tripping, gaslighting, or emotional manipulation. Gaslighting, for example, is when someone makes you question your own memory or perception. You say, "That hurt my feelings." They respond, "You're too sensitive. That never happened." Your brain suddenly goes into confusion mode. Wait, did it happen? Am I overreacting? This confusion is powerful because the human brain hates uncertainty. When we feel uncertain, we often default to self-doubt. And toxic people, whether intentionally or not, use that uncertainty to maintain control in relationships. But here's the empowering part. Once you understand the pattern, the spell breaks. You stop trying to fix them, and you start protecting yourself. One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with toxic individuals is believing they can win the relationship. That if they explain themselves better, stay calmer, try harder, eventually the toxic person will understand. But psychologically, toxic dynamics often survive because of participation. Think of it like a dance. If one person stops dancing, the dance ends. And this is where boundaries enter the story. Now, boundaries sound simple in theory, just set boundaries, but emotionally, they're incredibly difficult, especially if you grew up being taught that being a good person means always being accommodating. So when you say no, your brain fires off alarm bells. Guilt, fear, anxiety. You might even feel like you're being selfish. But boundaries are not punishments, they're instructions. They tell people how they are allowed to treat you. And here's something fascinating psychologists have observed when dealing with toxic personalities. Toxic people often react strongly when you first set boundaries, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it removes the control they were used to having. You might notice them getting defensive, dramatic, or suddenly playing the victim. This reaction can trick you into backing down. But what you're witnessing is not proof your boundary was wrong, it's proof the boundary was necessary. And over time, something interesting happens. Healthy people respect boundaries. Toxic people resist them, which means boundaries become a kind of filter for your life. The people who truly care about you adapt. The ones who thrived on draining you slowly fade away. Now here's another powerful strategy that psychologists often recommend when dealing with highly toxic personalities. It's called the gray rock method. The name sounds strange, but the concept is simple. Imagine trying to have an emotional argument with a rock. A rock doesn't react, it doesn't engage, it doesn't provide drama. It just sits there, boring and neutral. Toxic people often feed off emotional reactions, anger, frustration, defensiveness. When you stop providing those reactions, the interaction becomes unrewarding for them. So instead of defending yourself in long explanations, you respond with short, calm answers. Okay, I see. That's your opinion. No drama, no fuel. This technique doesn't change the toxic person, but it dramatically reduces their power over your emotional state. And for many people, that shift alone is life-changing. But there's another layer to this conversation that we rarely talk about. Sometimes the hardest toxic people to deal with are the ones we can't simply walk away from. Family members, coworkers, long-term social circles. You can't just disappear. And that's where emotional detachment becomes essential. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop taking responsibility for someone else's behavior. If they criticize you, you don't carry it all day. If they start drama, you don't feel obligated to solve it. You begin seeing their behavior not as a reflection of your worth, but as a reflection of their patterns. Psychologists call this cognitive reframing. Instead of thinking, why are they treating me like this? You begin thinking, this is their pattern again. That subtle shift creates emotional distance. It turns chaos into observation. And observation is powerful, because when you're observing something, you're no longer trapped inside it. Now, let's talk about one of the most important truths about toxic relationships. They can be addictive, not in the traditional sense, but psychologically. Toxic dynamics often run on unpredictable emotional cycles. One day, the person criticizes you. The next day, they compliment you. One day, they ignore you. The next day, they suddenly act kind. This unpredictability creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Your brain keeps thinking, maybe next time will be different. So you stay. You keep hoping the good version of the person will come back. But understanding this pattern helps you step outside of it. You realize the kindness is not necessarily a permanent change. It's part of the cycle. And once you see the cycle clearly, it becomes much easier to stop chasing approval from someone who constantly moves the goalposts. Now here's something that might surprise you. Dealing with toxic people can actually make you psychologically stronger. Not because the experience is pleasant, but because it forces you to develop skills most people never consciously practice. Boundary setting, emotional regulation, self-awareness, the ability to recognize manipulation, the ability to stay calm under pressure. These are not small abilities, they're life skills. In fact, many psychologists say that people who learn to navigate difficult personalities often develop incredibly strong emotional intelligence over time. They become better at reading people, better at protecting their energy, better at choosing healthier relationships. And eventually, something interesting happens. You stop attracting as many toxic dynamics. Not because toxic people disappear from the world, but because your behavior stops rewarding their patterns. You become harder to manipulate, harder to guilt trip, harder to emotionally drain. And when that shift happens, your social world slowly changes. You start gravitating towards people who respect your boundaries, people who communicate directly, people who don't leave you feeling exhausted after every conversation. Relationships start feeling lighter, healthier, more stable, and suddenly you realize something powerful. Dealing with toxic people was never about winning arguments with them. It was about learning how to choose yourself, learning that protecting your mental space isn't selfish, it's necessary, because the quality of your life is deeply tied to the emotional environments you allow around you. So if there's someone in your life who constantly drains you, manipulates you, or makes you question your own worth, take a moment and ask yourself something simple. What would protecting my peace actually look like here? Maybe it's a boundary. Maybe it's emotional distance. Maybe it's less access to your time and energy. Whatever it is, remember this: you don't need permission to protect your mental health. And